Thank you so much for coming before us today. We have you for 15 minutes. Please take your very thorough submission as read, and we're in your hands. Would you like to know at 10 minutes, the time at 10 minutes, so you could leave time for questions? Or
yeah, I'm good. I'll be following. I'll be tracking time. I want to thank you all for the privilege of coming to your beautiful country. I'm a volunteer and guest of Blind Low Vision New Zealand, and it is a privilege to be here. My name is David Lepofsky. I'm blind. I am a lawyer. I am a law professor, and I've spent much of the past 3 decades as a volunteer leading campaigns for accessibility legislation, first in the province of Ontario and then helping at the federal level as well. I've also had connections with people involved in similar activities in Israel and other countries, and I hope to share that collective expertise with you. You have a beautiful country. You have amazing and resilient people. You have people who I believe would want to do the right thing when it comes to accessibility legislation. I want to give you a completely candid and honest assessment of the bill before you. It is good that it is now undisputed here that people with disabilities in New Zealand face accessibility barriers throughout their lives. And it is good that the government, and I believe all of you, accept that legislation is needed to change that. The problem is that this bill, among all the accessibility bills I have seen in my country and elsewhere, sadly ranks among the weakest I have seen anywhere. And I believe the people of New Zealand would want and can do much better. I encourage you to look at this bill and ask yourselves and ask your colleagues, do we believe that an advisory committee is all New Zealand needs and is the best that it can do for all people with disabilities? Do you believe that at this point in time, that's all you can do? That's all you should do. If you don't believe that, then make this bill better. Let me offer you a couple of very quick thoughts. First, you've heard the agenda for reform. You've heard it over and over, and there is an incredible unity of message you are hearing because New Zealand has incredible leaders in its disability rights movement. They are not people who agree with each other on everything, but they certainly agree on this. The second thing is the government does not need more advice. Why, I could tell you the last time I had the privilege of being a guest in this country over 4 years ago, the message you are hearing in these hearings is the message I gave to senior staff at the Ministry of Social Development. And if you want, I can send you a link to the audio of the hour and a half where I presented the measures that you're now hearing are needed to them. It is not that you need more advice. It's the government must now act on that advice. Creating an advisory committee for which you do not need legislation, why, that's just a way of saying we're not going to act. And I believe that the people of New Zealand would want to do more than that. Let me next talk to the issue of cost. When you talk about accessibility and accessibility legislation, the question may come to your mind, well, can we afford it? Let me answer that. And the answer is you cannot afford this bill. You can't afford this bill because it does nothing to actually tear down barriers facing people with disabilities. Let me tell you the cost of this bill. The cost of this bill is leaving in place all the barriers in your tourism sector that will deter upwards of 1 billion tourists with disabilities from coming here. I think New Zealand would be financially better off if they came here and spent their tourism dollars here. That is a cost you are paying with this bill. A cost of this bill is the burdens on people with disabilities of having to fight the barriers they face one at a time. That is an incredible cost to dump on vulnerable people with disabilities in this country. But this bill makes New Zealanders pay that cost. A cost of this bill is burdening obligated organizations, whether the government of New Zealand or schools or municipalities or private businesses, it burdens them with the cost of having to each reinvent the accessibility wheel and figure out what they need to do one at a time. That is a wasteful, duplicative cost that would be reduced, if not eliminated, by enacting strong and effective accessibility standards. I think New Zealanders would prefer not to have to be burdened with that additional cost, and strong legislation like you're hearing from witness after witness would achieve the goal of reducing or eliminating that cost. So my view is you've got two choices. Either run up the cost to New Zealand by passing a weak bill that does nothing or no bill at all, or reduce costs to New Zealanders, indeed make accessibility a moneymaker for New Zealand by passing the strong legislation that you've been encouraged by so many to do. Let me conclude by offering you what I would call a down payment. I share the view of those who've come before you that because your officials know fully what is needed, you could convert this bill in the next 8 weeks into a strong bill that could be passed before the election. But one down payment on that, and it's not all you need, and I don't mean payment in the way of money, but putting legislation where your intent is, would be to do two things, just as a start. Now, these are not the only things I recommend, but I'm going to gamble you'd all agree on this. First, how about requiring that not $1 can be spent of public money ever again to create new accessibility barriers? How about obliging the government, both nationally and locally, to ensure that when they spend money on infrastructure or they give money for grants or loans, that none of that money is ever used to make things worse? Who could oppose that? Second, how about requiring in your universities and your post-secondary educational facilities programs that anyone trained to be a design professional or an information technology professional, that they need to be trained as part of that in accessible design? If they're going to learn to design a building, they should learn how to design, they should be required to learn how to design an accessible building. And similarly, if they're going to be designing websites and web applications, they should be trained as part of that to design accessible web applications and websites. If you do that, you'll not only better serve your public, but you'll have a cohort of access design professionals who can also sell their skills abroad right from here, which will be great for New Zealand internationally and financially. I hope these ideas help. I welcome the opportunity to take your questions. I'm in your beautiful country till Thursday morning, and anything I can do while I'm here as a volunteer of this campaign, I would welcome the chance to do. Thank you so much for the privilege of being able to speak to you.
Thank you so much, David. A exceptional submission. Really appreciate you taking the time to come to our country. We have a question from Dr. Liz Craig.
Thank you, David. It was a really amazing and comprehensive submission. In your written submission, you also talk about us learning from Canada's successes and our mistakes. What would be your advice thinking through some of the Canadian experience in terms of, once you actually get to the stage of implementing legislation that New Zealand should be aware of as we move forward?
I am not here by any stretch to say we Canadians got it all right. And I'd like you to show us up, do better. And I'd love to return home and say, let's catch up to New Zealand. And I say that as a proud Canadian. But what we've done well, federally and in Ontario, is to set in legislation a deadline for becoming fully accessible. What we have done well, at least in Ontario, is requiring the government to enact all the accessibility standards necessary to enact to achieve that goal. Federally, we've allowed for the creation of accessibility standards, but we've not required that they be created, and that's a failing federally. We have in both federally and provincially created enforcement powers, but I think we could do better. What we've learned in Ontario is you must have those enforcement powers in the hands of someone in a body that is independent of the government, because the government is the biggest obligated organization, and they are hopelessly conflicted if they must vigorously enforce against themselves. Our federal government did better on that. But unfortunately, rather than creating one enforcement body, they splintered enforcement among 3 enforcement bodies, creating duplication and confusion. I think those are some of the ideas that you could learn and do better than all of us by requiring that when public money is given out for procurement, for infrastructure, for loans, business development loans, that there be accessibility strings attached to them. And show us how to do that right, because sadly, we're not.
Thank you, David.
I'm not hearing anything.
You're on mute, Angie. Oh, sorry, team. So we have very short amount of time left, David. So we have Tony, then Jan, then Maureen.
If you each ask really fast, I'll answer collectively really fast.
Good call.
Hi, David. Thanks again. And it's lovely to see you on Zoom. I'd be love to have seen you in person or talk to you in person. Hey, look, just a quick question. What would be the first steps that you would advise us to really do to start with?
My advice is include the key components I've just said that you've heard from others in the bill. A goal, full accessibility, a deadline, a duty in law to remove and prevent barriers along reasonable timelines, a duty to create accessibility standards, and an enforcement mechanism.
Great, thank you. Jen.
Very quickly, so I'm just checking your view that we could convert this bill to deliver those things within the next 8 weeks. Is that based on your experience as a lawyer and having worked with governments overseas to be able to do this, and the knowledge of the research we have?
I also spent 33 years as a career government lawyer in the province of Ontario. If you get instructions to do it, you can do it. The bottom line is because the Access Matters campaign has been going on since 2017, like I said, they've got all the advice. They've had time to do all the research. You've got community leaders in the disability rights movement here with whom the discussions could be held extremely quickly, because you've already heard from everybody. They know what they need. So it's not a question of how to do it. It's a question of whether to do it.
Thank you. Moving quickly to Maureen.
Thank you. I will be fast. Thank you very much, David, for appearing here on our Select Committee. The legislation we have in front of us, as it's drafted, has some limitations, obviously. One of the challenges that we have as the Select Committee is going back with recommendations for change and having those recommendations discarded because they are seen as being outside the scope of the bill. How would you respond if some of these recommendations that we are being asked to implement or to include in this legislation is given that feedback?
Then I would say to you, I'd say 2 things. The first thing I'd say is that's parliamentary strategy. And you folks come from various political parties. If this bill can't be amended, so introduce another private member's bill or agree to do a government bill, or one better. If you come back with recommendations and all your parties agree on it, you are the parliament. The rules don't rule you, you rule them. And the other thing is, if the idea comes back, which a couple of you floated just as an idea to get feedback of, hey, how about if we just amend the bill to set priorities for this advisory committee? Can I tell you why to reject that? That kind of reform is like getting on at the dining room of the Titanic and saying the most important thing we need to talk about in the dining room of the Titanic is, what do you want for dinner? You're heading for an iceberg. What you have for dinner in the dining room is not the priority issue. The priority issue is fixing the bill.
Thank you, David. We're now just at time, so I would like to just acknowledge you for coming all this way, for your sound work in this area, and thank you very much for a really sound submission. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for the privilege of being able to speak to you.
Thank you. So I'm